fascinating piece of history that time forgot the absolutely baffling world of medieval justice. We're diving into a time when your guilt or innocence wasn't determined by evidence, witnesses, or even basic logic, but rather by whether you could survive being burned, drowned, or simply swallow bread without choking. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these sleepy historical journeys. And as always, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and get comfortable. We're about to enter a world where superstition ruled the courtroom, and common sense went to die. Let's step back in time to an era when justice was, well, let's just say they had some very creative ideas about how God revealed the truth. You are born into a world where logic doesn't exist, 1200s. You are born in medieval England sometime in the early 1200s into a world where the very concept of justice would make a modern person's head spin. The straw beneath your mother's birthing bed is still damp with blood and sweat when you take your first breath of air thick with wood smoke and the ever-present smell of unwashed bodies. You're not entering a world of careful investigation, reasonable doubt, or even basic fact-checking. No, you're born into a society that has decided the best way to determine guilt or innocence is to see if God will personally intervene to save you from various forms of torture and death. The midwife who helped deliver you crossed herself 3 times and muttered a prayer, not for your health, but to ward off any demons that might have been attracted by the sounds of your mother's labour. You're a peasant child, which means your understanding of the world comes from the village priest with his yellowed teeth and wine-stained robes, local superstitions passed down through generations of illiterate ancestors, and the occasional travelling merchant who brings news from other places where, presumably, they're just as confused about how justice should work. Your days are filled with the rhythm of agricultural life, the crowing of roosters before dawn, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the steady thunk of your mother's wooden spoon against the porridge pot. You grow up hearing stories about trials that sound more like elaborate suicide attempts than legal proceedings, told in hushed whispers around the communal fire pit where the entire village gathers each evening to share the day's gossip and fears. Your father explains it to you one evening by the fire, his weathered hands gesturing dramatically as sparks dance upward into the darkness above your heads. The orange glow illuminates his face, casting deep shadows in the lines carved by years of hard labour and constant worry. You see, child, when someone is accused of a crime, we don't waste time with all that nonsense about proof and evidence. God knows the truth, so we simply put the accused person in a situation where only divine intervention can save them. If they survive, they're innocent. If they die horribly, well, at least we know they were guilty. He pauses to take a long drink from his wooden cup filled with weak ale, then continues. Just last month, old Martha from the next village over was accused of stealing a loaf of bread. They made her carry a red-hot iron bar in her bare hands. When her flesh burned and blistered, everyone knew she was guilty. Simple as that. This makes perfect sense to your medieval mind, of course. Why would you need witnesses, physical evidence, or logical reasoning when you can just throw someone in a pond and see what happens? The local priest has explained it countless times during his lengthy sermons. God is watching everything. Every sparrow that falls, every grain of wheat that grows, every breath you take. Surely he wouldn't let an innocent person drown or burn to death just because some neighbours got suspicious about their character. Your neighbour accuses you of witchcraft, because why not? Years pass, and you're now a young adult, living in your small village, minding your own business, tending to your small plot of turnips and barley, when disaster strikes in the most medieval way possible. Your neighbour's cow dies, not from disease, not from old age, not from any of the 1,000 natural causes that kill medieval livestock daily. The harsh winter that left the animals half-starved, the contaminated water from the well that everyone knows tastes strange, or the simple fact that medieval cows don't exactly live pampered lives. No, clearly, obviously, this bovine tragedy occurred due to your noticed the cow was sick, being too busy trying to keep your own meagre possessions from falling apart, and your own stomach from growling too loudly during the priest's interminable Sunday sermons. You wake up one morning to find a small crowd gathered outside your dwelling, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air as they mutter among themselves, led by your neighbour, a man whose primary qualification for making legal accusations seems to be that he owns a dead cow and needs someone to blame. The group grows larger as curious villagers emerge from their homes like moths drawn to flame. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You looked at his cow funny last Tuesday. Also, you're a woman, which in medieval times is basically being guilty of something by default. Your neighbour had borrowed your wooden bucket just last week and returned it with a crack down the side, but apparently that grievance has been forgotten in favour of this much more serious accusation. You can see your other neighbours exchanging meaningful glances, their eyes bright with the kind of excitement that comes from finally having something interesting happen in their otherwise dreary lives. She gave my cow the evil eye, your neighbour declares with the confidence of someone who has just solved a complex mystery, his voice carrying across the small square where the village well sits. I saw her looking at it with that look. You know the one. He gestures dramatically toward you, his pointing finger trembling with either righteous indignation or too much ale from the night before. Everyone nods sagely, because apparently everyone knows exactly what that look means, even though no one can quite describe it. Old Agnes from the bakery crosses herself and mutters something about how she always knew there was something strange about you, conveniently forgetting that she praised your herb garden just last month and asked for your advice on growing rosemary. The local reeve, think of him as a medieval middle manager with life and death authority, arrives to investigate, his leather boots squelching in the mud as he pushes through the crowd. His investigation consists of asking your neighbour to repeat his accusation, nodding thoughtfully as if considering great philosophical truths, and then asking you if you're a witch. When you say no, because you're not, he furrows his brow as if this response is somehow suspicious. His weathered face scrunches up in concentration as he strokes his greying beard, clearly working through the complex logic of the situation. After all, wouldn't a witch deny being a witch? But then again, wouldn't an innocent person also deny being a witch? This circular logic is already making your head hurt, and the trial hasn't even started yet. The reeve's assistant, a young man who looks barely old enough to shave, scribbles notes on a piece of parchment with a quill that keeps splattering ink as if recording these profound legal insights for posterity. Trial by hot iron, God's thermometer. The reeve decides that your case requires trial by ordeal, specifically trial by hot iron, because apparently someone in the distant past decided that the creator of the universe has nothing better to do than personally regulate the temperature sensitivity of every accused person's hands. The decision is announced with great solemnity, as if he's just proclaimed a feast day rather than ordered what amounts to sanctioned torture. The crowd murmurs with approval and anticipation. This is better entertainment than the travelling minstrel who visited last spring with his off-key ballads and flea-ridden dog. You notice children being hoisted onto their father's shoulders for a better view, their bright eyes wide with the kind of morbid fascination that knows no historical boundaries. The theory, as it's explained to you by the local priest while he prepares the iron in a blazing fire, is beautifully simple in its complete absurdity. The priest, Father Benedict, speaks in the measured tones he usually reserves for explaining the mysteries of transubstantiation, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, from both the heat of the fire and the weight of his theological responsibility. God, being just and all-knowing, you're still not entirely sure how one commits, the red-hot iron bar won't burn you. If you're guilty, it will burn you severely, and everyone will know you're a witch. He gestures toward the fire with his gnarled hands, explaining how this method has been used since time immemorial, how it's sanctioned by holy law, and how many cases of guilt and innocence have been revealed through this divine process. His voice carries the certainty of someone who has never had to grab a piece of molten metal to prove his spiritual standing. You watch the iron bar heating in the fire, glowing first red, then orange, then that special shade of white hot that screams, "This will definitely cause third-degree burns, regardless of your spiritual state." The blacksmith's apprentice tends the fire, pumping the bellows with methodical precision, his face flushed from the heat and the importance of his role in this divine process. Sparks dance upward like tiny fallen stars, and the metal makes small crackling sounds as it reaches the perfect temperature for either miracle or mutilation. The priest blesses the fire, the iron, and you, though the blessing feels somewhat perfunctory given that everyone's expecting God to either perform a miracle or watch you suffer horrifically. He sprinkles holy water that instantly turns to steam when it hits the heated metal, and chants Latin phrases that sound impressive but offer little comfort when you're about to voluntarily grab something that could easily brand cattle. When the moment comes, you're required to pick up the iron bar and carry it a distance of 9 feet. 9 feet. Someone, at some point, decided that 9 feet was the exact distance God needed to demonstrate your innocence. Not 8 feet, which would be insufficient, and not 10 feet, which would apparently be asking too much of divine intervention. The distance has been carefully measured and marked with stones, creating a path that looks absurdly short for something that will determine whether you live or die. You wonder briefly who made this decision. Some long-dead theologian, sitting in a comfortable monastery, perhaps, calculating the precise distance required for divine judgment. While sipping wine and eating bread that someone else baked, you grasp the glowing metal. The pain is immediate, intense, and exactly what any reasonable person would expect from holding something that's been sitting in a fire for an hour. Your flesh sizzles, literally sizzles, as you force yourself to walk those 9 agonizing feet while the entire village watches to see if God will perform a miracle on your behalf. The smell of burning skin fills the air, mixing with the wood smoke and the collective held breath of dozens of spectators. Each step feels like an eternity, your feet moving automatically while your mind screams in protest. You can hear someone's child asking their mother why you're making those sounds, and the mother's hushed response that this is how God reveals the truth. Spoiler alert. He doesn't. Your hands are severely burned, blistered, and already showing signs of the kind of damage that, in a world without antibiotics or proper medical care, often leads to infection. The flesh is already beginning to bubble and char, the pain so intense that you can barely think straight. But the trial isn't over yet. Oh no, that would be too simple. The priest explains that the real test comes in the healing, or lack thereof. Your hands will be wrapped in clean linen, sealed with the priest's wax, and examined in 3 days. If they're healing well, you might be innocent. If they're festering and infected, well, that's clearly a sign of your guilt and God's displeasure. The logic is flawless. If medieval medical care fails to prevent infection in severely burned flesh, it's obviously because you're a witch. The 3-day healing test. Now comes the really ridiculous part. Your burnt hands are bandaged and sealed with the priest's personal wax seal, as if your flesh might somehow cheat during the healing process, and you're told to return in 3 days. The bandages are rough linen that feels like sandpaper against your raw wounds, and the priest's assistant ties them with hemp rope that cuts into your wrists. should be obvious to anyone with basic theological training. You spend 3 days in agony, your hands throbbing with pain that makes sleep nearly impossible, knowing that your life depends not on evidence or justice, but on whether your medieval immune system can fight off infection from deliberately inflicted wounds. Every heartbeat sends fresh waves of pain up your arms, and you find yourself cradling your bandaged hands against your chest like broken birds. You try to keep the bandages clean, but this is the 13th century, so your understanding of hygiene is limited to: don't eat things that are obviously rotting, and try not to touch dead animals with open wounds. Your daily life becomes a careful dance around contamination. You can't milk the goat properly, can't knead bread, can't even wipe your own face without risking exposure to the countless sources of filth that surround medieval existence. Your sister helps when she can, but she has her own family to tend, and there's an unspoken fear in her eyes that suggests she's already preparing for your inevitable fate. The pain keeps you awake most nights, and you spend the dark hours listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Dogs barking at imagined threats, the occasional cry of a baby, the creak of wooden buildings shifting in the wind. You pray, of course, because what else can you do? You pray with the desperate fervour of someone who knows their life hangs in the balance, bargaining with God like a merchant haggling over grain prices. You promise to be a better Christian, to give more to the poor, to never again look sideways at anyone's livestock. But even as you pray, you can feel the heat building under the bandages, the telltale signs of your body's completely predictable response to severe trauma. When the 3 days are up, the entire village gathers again for the grand unveiling, as if this were a feast day celebration rather than a potential execution. Children who should be helping with chores instead cluster around their parents, their eyes bright with excitement. The baker closes his shop early, and even the usually absent miller makes an appearance, flour still dusting his clothes. The priest removes your bandages with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred ritual, which, in his mind, he is. He murmurs Latin prayers under his breath, while carefully unwrapping each layer of linen, the crowd pressing closer with each reveal. Your hands are, well, they're exactly what you'd expect hands to look like after being deliberately burned, and then left to heal in medieval conditions, while you try to continue living your normal life of hauling water, feeding animals, and handling whatever tools necessary for survival. The burns are infected. Of course they're infected. You've been handling farm tools with leather handles that haven't been cleaned in years, cooking food over a fire that belches smoke and ash, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life with severe burns on your hands in an era when the height of medical sophistication is pray harder and maybe try some herbs the old women swear by. The flesh around the burn marks is red and swollen, with the telltale streaks that even medieval people recognise as a bad sign. There's a smell too, the sweet sickly odour of infection that makes several people in the crowd step back and cover their noses with their sleeves. The priest nods gravely, his expression suggesting that he's just received confirmation of something he already knew. The infection proves your guilt, he announces, his voice carrying across the small crowd with the authority of divine revelation. God has rejected your flesh. You want to point out that God might simply be following the basic laws of biology that he presumably created, or perhaps deliberately burning someone and then expecting miraculous healing might be asking a bit much even from the Almighty. But medieval theological discussions tend to be one-sided affairs, especially when you're the one being accused of consorting with dark forces. The crowd murmurs and nods, satisfied that justice has been served and the mystery of the dead cow has been solved through the application of divine wisdom and red-hot metal. Your legal troubles aren't over yet, because you survived the iron ordeal, albeit with infected hands that throb with every heartbeat and have started to smell like rotting meat. Some people in the village aren't entirely convinced of your guilt. Your neighbour with the dead cow, in particular, seems disappointed that the first trial didn't result in immediate execution, and he's been whispering to anyone who'll listen that perhaps the first test wasn't conclusive enough. This calls for a second opinion, medieval style, trial by cold water. The village elder, a man so old he claims to remember when the current king was just a prince, strokes his wispy beard and declares that sometimes God requires multiple tests to reveal his will, as if the Almighty might be having an off day and needs to double-check his work. The theory behind this ordeal is even more baffling than the hot iron test, if such a thing is possible in a world where logic has clearly taken an extended vacation. The logic, as explained to you by the same priest who recently declared your infected burns proof of witchcraft, is that water is pure and holy, having been blessed by God during creation and at every baptism since the beginning of Christianity. Therefore, pure water will reject anything evil, the same way oil and water naturally separate, or how a healthy body rejects poison. If you're innocent, the water will accept you into its embrace like a loving mother, and you'll sink peacefully to the bottom. If you're guilty, the water will reject you with the fury of offended purity, and you'll float like a piece of contaminated debris that refuses to be cleansed. Let's pause here to appreciate the full absurdity of this situation. You're being told that if you sink and drown, it proves you are innocent all along, and everyone will feel very sorry about the whole misunderstanding while they fish your lifeless body from the pond and give you a proper Christian burial. If you float and survive, it proves you're guilty beyond any shadow of doubt, and they'll execute you anyway, probably by burning, since that seems to be the preferred method for dealing with witches. It's like a medieval legal system designed by someone who really, really wanted to ensure that accused people die regardless of the outcome. A judicial, heads I win, tails you lose situation that would make a crooked merchant blush with shame. The priest explains this with the same serene confidence he uses when discussing the mystery of the Trinity, as if the logical contradictions are simply beyond the understanding of common folk. You're taken to the village pond on a grey morning that feels appropriately ominous for what's essentially a judicial drowning attempt. The sky hangs low and threatening, pregnant with clouds that seem to mirror the mood of the assembled crowd. The pond itself is a murky body of water where the village ducks paddle and defecate, where children sometimes swim in summer, and where everyone knows old Henrik threw his dead cat last winter rather than bury it properly. The priest blesses the water while you're bound with ropes, your thumbs tied to your opposite big toes in a configuration that makes swimming impossible, even if you weren't innocent. The rope burns against your skin, and the binding position forces you into an awkward crouch that makes breathing difficult, even before you enter the water. Your infected hands scream in protest as the ropes tighten, adding fresh agony to your already considerable suffering. A crowd gathers to watch what everyone hopes will be a definitive answer to the question of your guilt, their faces bearing the same eager expression people wear when watching a particularly exciting public execution or a travelling circus. Children are given a front row view of what their society considers justice, positioned by their parents so they can see clearly how God reveals truth through systematic drowning. This explains a lot about how medieval people turned out psychologically, and why stories of the time are filled with casual violence and supernatural explanations for perfectly natural phenomena. The baker brings fresh bread to sell to spectators, because even divine justice is an opportunity for commerce. You're lowered into the pond like a human tea bag, while the village watches to see if you'll sink. guilty and soon to be dead. The water is shockingly cold, colder than you expected even on this grey morning, and it immediately soaks through your rough woolen dress, making the fabric heavy and clingy. The ropes make any coordinated movement impossible, and you can feel the muddy bottom of the pond beneath your feet for just a moment before the depth increases, and you're truly at the mercy of physics, theology, and the questionable wisdom of medieval jurisprudence. You struggle against the bindings, trying desperately to stay above water, which unfortunately makes you float. Your body's natural buoyancy, combined with the trapped air in your clothing and your desperate movements, keeps you bobbing at the surface like a cork. The crowd murmurs excitedly, their voices rising with the thrill of divine revelation. Floating is proof of guilt. The water has rejected you like a defiled offering. God has spoken through the sacred medium of pond water. You're pulled from the pond, coughing and shivering, pond scum clinging to your hair and dress, only to be informed that your survival has just sealed your fate. The priest nods solemnly while wringing water from his own robes, declaring that the water's rejection of your body is as clear a sign as any burning bush or parting sea. Your chattering teeth and blue lips are apparently less important than the theological implications of your buoyancy. Trial by combat. Violence as justice. As if your day couldn't get any worse, someone suggests that perhaps this matter should be settled by trial by combat, because apparently the first two attempts at divine justice weren't quite enough to satisfy the bloodthirsty curiosity of your fellow villagers. The suggestion comes from Thomas the Miller, a man who's been nursing a grudge against you ever since you pointed out that his scales might be weighted in his favour. His voice carries across the crowd with the enthusiasm of someone who's just discovered a new form of entertainment that doesn't cost him anything to watch. Trial by combat operates on the principle that God will grant victory to whoever is righteous in their cause, which means justice is determined by whoever is better at hitting people with weapons. The logic is beautifully simple. If you're innocent, God will ensure your victory through divine intervention, supernatural strength, or perhaps by causing your opponent to trip at a crucial moment. If you're guilty, God will allow you to be beaten, stabbed, or bludgeoned into submission, thus revealing his judgment through the medium of interpersonal violence. You're a peasant woman with infected burns on your hands, who just nearly drowned in a pond, your dress still damp and clinging uncomfortably to your shivering body. You are not, by any stretch of the imagination, equipped for mortal combat. Your experience with weapons extends to occasionally wielding a wooden spoon with threatening intent when the neighbour's chickens get into your garden, and your current physical condition makes you about as formidable as a wet cat with a limp. Your hands are still wrapped in bandages that are now soggy from your recent aquatic trial, and every movement sends fresh waves of pain through your damaged flesh. Fortunately, the legal system has anticipated this problem with the same thoughtful consideration it applies to all its other procedures. You're allowed to hire a champion, a professional fighter who will represent you in battle, assuming you can somehow scrape together the money to pay for what amounts to a life or death mercenary service. This creates an interesting theological question that somehow never seemed to bother medieval thinkers, who are remarkably gifted at ignoring logical contradictions when they interfered with exciting spectacles. If God grants victory to the righteous, and you hire someone else to fight for you, is God judging your righteousness, or your champion's? What if you're innocent, but your champion is a terrible person who beats his wife and steals from orphans? What if you're guilty, but your champion is a saint who spends his free time feeding the poor and caring for lepers? Does God's judgment transfer through the payment of coins, like some sort of spiritual banking system? These are the kinds kinds of logical problems that arise when you use violence as a judicial system, but medieval people were remarkably good at ignoring logical problems, especially when the alternative was admitting that their entire legal framework made about as much sense as trying to determine the weather by examining chicken entrails. Your champion is a grizzled man named Edgar, who fights for money and seems to view the whole proceeding as a slightly more formal version of a tavern brawl. His face is a map of old scars. His knuckles are permanently swollen from years of hitting things, and his breath smells like ale and questionable decisions. He's missing 3 teeth and part of his left ear, presumably casualties from previous attempts at divine justice. Edgar explains his fees with the casual tone of someone discussing the price of barley. So much for showing up, so much extra if he actually has to kill someone, and a bonus if the fight goes longer than anyone expects. He seems genuinely unconcerned about your innocence or guilt, treating the theological implications of the combat as someone else's problem. Your accuser has hired his own champion, a younger man who's clearly been eating better food and getting more practice with sharp objects. This champion has all his teeth, both ears, and the kind of confident swagger that suggests he's been winning more fights than he's been losing. The combat takes place in a field outside the village, with the entire community gathered to watch 2 men who have never met you or your accuser attempt to determine your guilt by trying to kill each other. The field has been marked out with stones, creating a rough circle that serves as the arena for this divinely guided violence. Vendors move through the crowd, selling meat pies and ale, because even judicial combat is an opportunity for enterprising merchants to make a profit. Children climb trees for better views, their parents making no effort to shield them from what amounts to sanctioned attempted murder. The priest blesses both fighters and their weapons, asking God to guide the battle toward justice, apparently without seeing any irony in asking the Prince of Peace to help settle a legal dispute through violence. He sprinkles holy water on swords that will soon be trying to separate souls from bodies, and prays for divine guidance in what is essentially a formalised attempt at homicide. The fight is brutal, messy, and decisive. Your champion loses. The battle begins with the ritual formality of a dance, both men circling each other and testing their opponent's reach and reflexes. But once the first blow is struck, the veneer of civilization disappears entirely. There's nothing elegant or noble about the combat. It's a desperate, ugly scramble involving fists, weapons, and a disturbing amount of grunting and cursing. Blood soaks into the dirt of the field, and the crowd cheers with the enthusiasm usually reserved for harvest festivals or wedding celebrations. Edgar fights valiantly, but he's older, slower, and possibly less sober than his opponent. He doesn't die, but he's badly wounded and yields, which means God has apparently determined that you're guilty of witchcraft. The theological implications of this, that the creator of the universe personally intervened in a stick fight to ensure the correct outcome, don't seem to trouble anyone present. The crowd disperses satisfied that justice has been served, divine will has been revealed, and they've gotten their money's worth of entertainment for the day. Trial by blessed bread, the choking test. But the village isn't quite done with you yet, because apparently your legal ordeal has become the most entertaining thing to happen in this god-forsaken place since the travelling juggler fell into the pig pen last Christmas. Someone suggests one final test. Trial by Korsned, also known as the ordeal of the accursed morsel. This involves eating a piece of blessed bread while praying that you don't choke on it, because choking would prove that God finds you so reprehensible that he won't even let you swallow consecrated carbohydrates. The suggestion comes from old Martha, the village village's self-appointed expert on all things supernatural, who claims her grandmother once saw this test used on a horse thief 3 villages over. The crowd murmurs with renewed interest, because after watching you burn, nearly drown, and witness a bloody combat, they're apparently not quite satisfied with the thoroughness of divine justice. It's as if they're determined to exhaust every possible method of determining guilt short of actually examining any evidence. The priest prepares a chunk of bread. Not just any bread, but specially blessed bread that has been prayed over and consecrated for the specific purpose of potentially killing you through divine intervention. Father Benedict takes his responsibility seriously, spending nearly an hour blessing the loaf with prayers, holy water, and enough Latin incantations to sanctify a cathedral. The bread itself is coarse and dark, the kind of heavy peasant loaf that's difficult to swallow even under the best circumstances. He cuts a piece roughly the size of a child's fist, explaining that it must be large enough for God to work with, but not so large as to guarantee choking regardless of spiritual state. The theological precision required for determining the proper size of a potentially lethal, blessed biscuit seems to escape no one's notice, though no one questions the wisdom of the measurement. You're required to eat this bread while the priest recites prayers asking God to make it stick in your throat if you're guilty, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of someone calling down divine judgment through the medium of baked goods. The psychological pressure alone is enough to make anyone's throat constrict. You're exhausted beyond description, traumatized by days of systematic torture disguised as legal proceedings, and have spent the last week being subjected to various forms of religiously sanctioned abuse that would make a professional torturer blush with shame. Your hands are infected and throbbing with pain that makes simple tasks like holding objects an exercise in endurance. You're still damp from nearly drowning, your clothes clinging uncomfortably to your skin and smelling of pond water and desperation. And you've just watched 2 strangers beat each other unconscious to determine your spiritual state, their blood still staining the ground where everyone can see it. Now you're being asked to eat bread, while a priest essentially curses it to choke you if you're guilty, as if food itself has become a weapon in God's arsenal of justice. The assembled crowd watches with the same intensity they usually reserve for watching a house fire or a public execution, their faces bright with anticipation and morbid curiosity. You take the bread in your trembling, burned hands and place it in your mouth, the rough texture scraping against your tongue like sawdust mixed with pebbles. The entire village watches in complete silence as you attempt to chew and swallow what might as well be called the bread of judgment, their collective attention focused on your throat with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts. Your throat is dry from fear, your mouth is parched from stress and the lingering taste of pond water, and the bread seems to expand in your mouth like a medieval sponge of doom. Every chew requires conscious effort, and you can feel your jaw muscles working against the dense, unforgiving texture. The bread absorbs what little saliva you have left, creating a paste that clings to your teeth and gums with the tenacity of mortar. Children in the crowd lean forward, their young faces eager to witness either a miracle of innocence or a divine execution by baked goods. You manage to swallow it, though not without difficulty, that makes your eyes water and your chest constrict with effort. The bread goes down in painful chunks, each swallow a small victory against both theology and basic human physiology. The priest nods thoughtfully, as if he's just witnessed a complex theological revelation, rather than someone struggling to eat under impossible circumstances. The fact that you didn't actually choke to death is taken as mild evidence in your favour, though by this point the village has already decided you're guilty based on the floating incident, so your successful bread consumption is viewed more as a curiosity than as exoneration. breadcrumbs on your lips and the sour taste of fear in your mouth, while everyone debates what your survival actually means in the grand theological scheme of things. The completely backward burden of proof. What you're experiencing is a legal system that has turned the concept of burden of proof completely upside down, inside out, and then set it on fire for good measure. In the modern world, if someone accuses you of a crime, they need to prove you did it through evidence, witnesses, logical reasoning, and a careful examination of facts that can be verified by multiple sources. In medieval times, if someone accuses you of a crime, you need to prove that God likes you enough to perform miracles on your behalf, while you're being systematically tortured by representatives of his church. The accuser needs to do nothing more than point a finger and make a claim, while you're expected to demonstrate supernatural divine favour through your ability to withstand physical trials that would challenge the endurance of biblical martyrs. Your neighbour didn't need to prove you cast spells on his cow. He simply needed to say you did. And suddenly, the burden shifted entirely to you to prove that you possess some sort of magical immunity to pain, drowning, and the basic laws of human biology. This is not a small distinction. You're not being asked to provide an alibi, explain your whereabouts during the supposed cow-cursing incident, or offer evidence of your innocence like witness testimony or character references from people who've known you since childhood. You're being asked to demonstrate that the creator of the universe will personally intervene in the laws of physics to prevent you from being burned, drowned, or beaten to death by people who've already made up their minds about your guilt. The theological implications are staggering. Essentially, every trial becomes a test of whether God considers you worthy of a miracle, as if the Almighty has nothing better to do than personally oversee the judicial system of every small village in England. It assumes that God will consistently and reliably perform supernatural interventions to protect innocent people, which raises uncomfortable questions about all the genuinely innocent people throughout history who have suffered terrible fates without divine rescue. The impossibility of this standard seems to escape everyone involved in your trials, from the priest who blesses the instruments of torture, to the neighbours who cheer when you fail to demonstrate supernatural powers, when your hands become infected after being deliberately burned with red-hot iron. This isn't seen as the natural result of medieval medicine's limitations, poor hygiene, and the complete absence of antibiotics or proper wound care. Instead, is interpreted as God's personal rejection of your character, as if the Lord of all creation took time from managing the affairs of kingdoms and the movement of stars to personally ensure that your burns would fester as a sign of his displeasure. When you float in the pond, instead of sinking and drowning like a proper innocent person should, this isn't attributed to normal human buoyancy, the air trapped in your clothing, or your natural survival instincts. No, it's clearly divine judgment, manifesting through the spiritual properties of murky pond water that doubles as the village's primary source of drinking water and sewage disposal. You're trapped in a system where innocence can only be proven by surviving what should, by all rights, kill you, and where the natural limitations of human physiology are interpreted as spiritual failings worthy of execution. It's like being asked to prove your innocence by flying, and when you inevitably fail to leave the ground, having everyone nod knowingly and say, "Well, obviously she's guilty. Innocent people can fly." The standards of proof required would challenge the abilities of actual saints and angels, yet they're applied to ordinary peasants, whose greatest supernatural achievement is occasionally predicting when it's going to rain based on how their joints feel. You're expected to demonstrate powers that would make biblical prophets jealous, all while maintaining the humble demeanour of someone who definitely doesn't consort with dark forces. It's a theological catch-22 that would be amusing potentially fatal. The circular logic is perfect and perfectly insane, a closed system that admits no possibility of error or reconsideration. If you survive the ordeals, you might be innocent, but you might also be a witch, whose dark powers protected you from harm, which means survival becomes its own form of suspicious behaviour. If you die during the ordeals, you're definitely innocent, but also definitely dead, so your vindication is somewhat academic and provides little comfort to your grieving family. If you're injured but survive, like you have been, it's proof that God finds you spiritually wanting, but not quite evil enough to kill outright, which places you in a theological grey area that satisfies no one and resolves nothing. The system has been designed, whether intentionally or through sheer incompetence, to produce no clear outcomes while maximising suffering for the accused. It's as if someone sat down and deliberately constructed a legal framework that would make actual justice as unlikely as possible while maintaining the illusion of divine guidance and moral certainty. Complication. Popularity contests as legal defence. Fortunately for you, the medieval legal system offers one more option: complication, which is essentially a popularity contest disguised as divine judgment, because apparently the authorities have decided that your survival of multiple torture sessions wasn't quite conclusive enough. In complication, you can prove your innocence by finding enough people willing to swear that you're not the kind of person who would give cows the evil eye, curse harvests, or engage in midnight dancing with supernatural entities. It's a system that assumes God will strike down anyone who lies under oath, which means your fate now depends not on evidence or divine intervention through physical trials, but on whether enough people in your community are willing to risk eternal damnation to save your life. The theological logic is that false oath helpers will be punished by God eventually, even if not immediately, so their willingness to swear for you serves as a divine truth detector operating on a somewhat delayed schedule. These people are called oath helpers, and their job is not to testify about facts or provide evidence about your whereabouts, actions, or character based on personal observation. They don't need to know where you were when the cow died, whether they saw you casting spells, or whether you even own any magical powers beyond the ability to occasionally predict weather changes based on joint pain. They just need to be willing to publicly declare that you have good character and are probably not a witch, based on their general knowledge of you as a neighbour and community member. It's character witnessing rather than fact witnessing, which sounds reasonable until you realise that it's still asking people to risk divine punishment for what amounts to educated guessing about your spiritual state. The oath helpers will stand before the priest and the assembled community, place their hands on holy relics or scripture, and swear by their immortal souls that you possess the kind of moral character that would make witchcraft unlikely. The number of oath helpers you need depends on the severity of the crime and your social status, because even divine justice apparently operates on a sliding scale based on medieval social hierarchies. For witchcraft accusations against a peasant woman like yourself, you need 12 people willing to swear to your good character, which, in a small village where everyone knows everyone else's business, going back 3 generations, is either very easy or completely impossible, depending on how well liked you are and how seriously people take the recent accusations. If you were a nobleman, you might need fewer oath helpers, and if you were accused of a lesser crime like stealing a chicken, you might get away with only 6 or 7 people willing to vouch for you. The mathematical precision of divine judgment apparently requires exactly 12 character witnesses for witch-related offences, no more and no less. You begin the humiliating process of asking your neighbours to serve as oath helpers, which feels remarkably like campaigning for political office, except that losing means death by fire rather than mere public embarrassment. This involves going door to door, hat literally in hand, explaining that you need people to publicly vouch for your non-witch status, and hoping that your recent performances in various judicial ordeals haven't completely destroyed your reputation among people who've known you since childhood. Each conversation becomes an exercise in persuasion, negotiation, and sometimes outright begging, as you try to convince people that associating themselves with your case won't bring suspicion down upon their own heads. You find yourself rehearsing explanations for your floating in the pond, your infected burns, and your champion's defeat in combat, trying to put the best possible spin on what most people are interpreting as clear signs of guilt. Your first stop is your cousin Margaret, who agrees immediately because family loyalty is important, even when it involves potentially perjuring yourself before God about someone's magical abilities. Margaret has known you since you were both children, playing in the mud behind the church, and she's seen you at your worst moments, sobbing over failed harvests, cursing stubborn goats, and generally behaving like a normal human being rather than a supernatural entity. Her quick agreement brings tears to your eyes, though she does make you promise to help with her husband's ploughing next spring, assuming you're still alive and not reduced to ashes. Your second stop is the baker, who owes you money from a grain transaction last autumn, and figures that helping you avoid execution is a reasonable way to settle the debt without having to part with actual coins. He's a practical man who's less concerned with your spiritual state than with maintaining good business relationships in the community. Finding the remaining 10 oath helpers proves more challenging than hunting for mushrooms in a drought. Some people are genuinely convinced by your ordeal performances that you might actually be a witch, particularly after the floating incident, which even you have to admit looked rather suspicious to observers who weren't actively drowning at the time. Others are simply afraid that associating with an accused witch might bring suspicion upon themselves, their families, and their livestock, because witch accusations have a tendency to spread like diseases through small communities. A few are using your desperation as an opportunity to settle old grudges or extract favours, treating your life or death situation as a chance to finally get compensation for perceived slights going back years. The miller's wife still remembers when your goat got loose and ate her cabbages 2 summers ago, and she's not inclined to risk divine punishment unless you make it worth her while. Mrs. Aldred, whose chickens you accidentally spooked last summer when you dropped a wooden bucket, refuses to serve as an oath helper unless you agree to give her your best laying hen, the one that produces the large brown eggs everyone envies. Tom the miller will vouch for your character in exchange for 3 bushels of grain, which represents a significant portion of your family's winter food supply. Everyone, it seems, has a price for swearing before God that you're not in league with the devil, and most of those prices involve tangible goods or future labour rather than simple Christian charity. The blacksmith wants you to help his wife with spinning for a month. The fisherman demands half your next pig, and the carpenter expects you to gather firewood for his family through the winter months. Eventually, you manage to assemble your 12 oath helpers, though the process has cost you most of your possessions, several promises of future labour that will keep you busy for the next 2 years, and what little dignity you had left after being subjected to multiple torture sessions. The group includes family members who couldn't abandon you without losing face in the community, people who owe you favours and figure this is a convenient way to settle their debts, people you're now indebted to in ways that will affect your life for years to come, and at least 2 individuals who clearly don't believe in your innocence but are participating for their own reasons. One because he wants your pig, and another because because he's hoping to curry favour with your cousin's husband, who's influential in village politics. The role of social class in your survival. Throughout this entire ordeal, you're painfully aware that your treatment has everything to do with your status as a peasant, and nothing to do with actual justice, a reality that becomes more bitter with each passing hour of systematic torture disguised as legal procedure. If you were a noble, you would never have been subjected to trial by ordeal in the first place. Nobles get trials by jury composed of their peers, men who understand the complexities of honour, property, and political alliances that govern aristocratic life. At worst, they might face trial by combat, but even then, they can hire professional fighters, champions who are well-fed, well-trained, and equipped with the finest weapons money can buy. When a noble faces accusations, the proceedings take place in proper courts, with scribes recording every word, witnesses giving sworn testimony, and legal scholars debating the finer points of law and precedent. Their trials are dignified affairs, conducted in halls with tapestries and proper seating, not muddy village squares where spectators bring their lunch and treat justice like entertainment. If you were wealthy, you could have paid substantial fines instead of undergoing physical ordeals, because medieval justice recognises that money is often a more practical solution than determining God's will through systematic torture. Wealthy merchants accused of crimes can settle matters with carefully calculated payments that take into account the severity of the offence, the social standing of the accuser, and the current market value of various forms of justice. A rich man accused of witchcraft might pay enough silver to build a new chapel, sponsor a feast for the poor, or fund repairs to the village church, and suddenly the community would discover that God's judgment can be satisfied through generous donations rather than hot iron tests. The wealthy understand that medieval justice, like everything else, operates according to economic principles that favour those with full purses and empty consciences. If you were a member of the clergy, you could have claimed benefit of clergy and been tried in church courts, which, while still medieval and illogical in their own special ways, are generally less focused on burning and drowning their defendants, and more concerned with matters of penance, prayer, and theological rehabilitation. Church courts recognise that men of God deserve different treatment than common peasants, operating under the assumption that those who serve the church should be judged by church law rather than secular brutality. A priest accused of witchcraft would face questioning by learned theologians, examination of his understanding of scripture, and perhaps assignment to a monastery for spiritual cleansing. The worst punishment might be defrocking or assignment to a remote parish, not being subjected to a series of potentially lethal physical tests designed to determine divine favour through survival of torture. But you're a peasant woman, which in the medieval social hierarchy puts you somewhere between livestock and actual humans in terms of legal rights, social value, and general concern for your continued existence. Your life is considered expendable enough that risking it in elaborate ordeals seems perfectly reasonable to everyone involved, from the priest who blesses the instruments of torture to the neighbours who gather to watch your suffering like it's a travelling carnival. The same people who would never dream of subjecting a knight to trial by hot iron, who would be horrified at the thought of making a merchant's wife carry glowing metal to prove her innocence, see nothing wrong with putting you through tests that would challenge the endurance of biblical martyrs. Your pain is entertainment, your terror is justice, and your potential death is simply the cost of maintaining social order in a world where your social betters matter more than your life. The village lord, who technically has authority over legal matters and could intervene if he chose to exercise his power, hasn't bothered to personally involve himself in your case beyond perhaps being informed that some peasant woman is facing witchcraft charges. Peasant accusations of witchcraft are beneath his notice unless they threaten his property, his tax revenue, or his political standing with other nobles. He's more concerned with hunting, managing his estates, and maintaining relationships with his social equals than with the life or death of a woman whose annual taxes wouldn't cover the cost of his horse's feed for a month. Your fate is being decided by a reeve who reports to a bailiff who occasionally mentions peasant matters to the lord if he's in a particularly good mood and has finished discussing more important topics like wool prices, marriage alliances, and the latest gossip from court. You watch nobles and wealthy merchants pass through the village during your trials, their fine clothes and well-fed horses marking them as clearly as painted signs. None of them are subjected to surprise tests of divine favour, sudden accusations from neighbours, or demands that they prove their innocence through supernatural means. Their guilt or innocence is determined by more mundane factors, like witness testimony from reliable sources, written records maintained by educated scribes, and the ability to pay fines that settle matters without bloodshed or divine intervention. It's only when you're poor that God's personal intervention becomes necessary for legal proceedings, as if the Almighty is only available for consultation when dealing with people who can't afford proper lawyers or adequate bribes. The wealthy live in a world where justice operates according to logical principles of evidence and compensation, while you inhabit a realm where your fate depends on whether pond water accepts or rejects your body. The Church offers sanctuary to those who can reach consecrated ground before being arrested, but this protection is primarily available to those who know about it in advance, have the means to travel to a church quickly, and possess the social connections to make sanctuary meaningful rather than merely delaying the inevitable. By the time accusations are made against you, your movements are being watched by neighbours who've appointed themselves as unofficial guards, and claiming sanctuary would essentially be an admission of guilt anyway, because innocent people supposedly have nothing to fear from divine justice. The sanctuary laws were written by and for people who understand how to navigate legal systems, not for illiterate peasants who learn about their rights only after it's too late to exercise them. When the system spectacularly fails as you're going through these ordeals, your flesh still bearing the marks of systematic torture disguised as divine justice, you're painfully aware that you're not the first person to be subjected to this particular brand of medieval justice, and the track record is not encouraging. The stories circulate through villages like folk tales, passed along by travelling merchants, wandering priests, and relatives visiting from distant places, each tale serving as both warning and entertainment for communities that seem to find comfort in the suffering of others. You've heard stories from other villages of people who died horribly during ordeals, only for evidence of their innocence to emerge later, usually when it was far too late to matter to anyone except the families left to grieve, and wonder if perhaps the system might have some minor flaws that no one wants to discuss publicly. These stories are told with the same casual tone people use when discussing the weather or crop prices, as if judicial murder through supernatural testing is just another unfortunate fact of medieval life. There was the case of poor Will from 3 villages over, who was subjected to trial by hot iron for stealing a sheep that later turned up alive and well in its original pasture, apparently having wandered off during a storm and taken shelter in a cave for several weeks. Unfortunately, this discovery came 2 days after Will died from infections caused by his burns, his final hours spent in agony while his family maintained a bedside vigil and prayed for a miracle that never came. The village held a memorial service and agreed that while Will was innocent of sheep theft, he probably had committed some other other sin that God decided to punish retroactively, because the alternative, admitting that their system of justice was fundamentally flawed, was apparently unthinkable. The priest gave a lengthy sermon about the mysterious ways of divine judgment, and everyone nodded sagely, as if this explanation made perfect sense, rather than being an obvious attempt to avoid responsibility for what amounted to murder through incompetence. Then there was the famous case of the woman who was accused of cursing a harvest and subsequently drowned during trial by water, her body pulled from the pond, while her children watched from the crowds of spectators who had gathered to witness divine justice in action. The next year's harvest was even worse, destroyed by the same combination of poor weather and soil exhaustion that had caused the original problems, which you'd think would exonerate her, and perhaps cause some reflection on the wisdom of drowning people based on agricultural disappointments. But instead it led to accusations against her surviving relatives, because apparently her evil influence was so powerful that it continued operating posthumously, reaching out from beyond the grave to blight crops and curse livestock. Her eldest daughter was forced to flee the village, and her younger children were taken in by reluctant relatives who made it clear that they were performing a Christian duty rather than offering genuine welcome to the offspring of a confirmed witch. These stories don't inspire confidence in the system's ability to distinguish between guilt and innocence, but they're accepted as unfortunate necessities in the pursuit of divine justice, like accepting that some percentage of soldiers will die in battle, or that some percentage of crops will fail due to weather. The occasional execution of innocent people is viewed as regrettable but inevitable, like bad weather or crop failures, natural disasters that must be endured rather than prevented through the application of logic, evidence, or basic human compassion. The villagers speak of these judicial failures with the same resigned acceptance they show toward plague outbreaks or devastating storms, as if wrongful execution is simply another hazard of medieval life that must be tolerated in the name of maintaining social order and demonstrating proper religious devotion. The economic factors behind these failures are becoming increasingly obvious to anyone who pays attention to the practical consequences of successful prosecutions. Villagers benefit from the property confiscation that follows successful prosecutions, with the accused's belongings, land, and livestock divided among officials, and sometimes distributed to community members who've proven their loyalty during the proceedings. Your small plot of land, your few chickens, and your modest collection of household goods represent a tempting prize for people who barely scrape by from season to season. Accusers benefit from removing rivals or settling personal grudges under the cover of spiritual justice, using the threat of witchcraft charges to resolve disputes over boundaries, debts, or social standing that might otherwise fester for years. Officials benefit from demonstrating their religious devotion by enthusiastically pursuing witches and criminals, showing their superiors and the community that they take their Christian duties seriously and can be trusted to maintain order through proper application of divine law. Your case is starting to attract attention from travelling merchants who've heard about the woman subjected to multiple ordeals, the story spreading along trade routes like gossip about royal scandals or news of distant wars. They're amused by the story, treating it as entertainment rather than recognising it as the judicial nightmare it actually is, discussing your trials over ale in taverns as if they were recounting a particularly dramatic folk tale or an amusing mishap, rather than systematic torture of a human being. Some are placing bets on whether you'll survive long enough to complete all the traditional tests, wagering coins and goods on your endurance like they might bet on cockfights or wrestling matches. The merchants find your situation hilarious rather than horrifying, prove that people can become inured to almost any level of cruelty when it's sanctioned by authority and tradition. Your daily life under constant threat. Living under suspicion of witchcraft means that every aspect of your daily life is now subject to scrutiny and reinterpretation by neighbours who've apparently appointed themselves as amateur theological investigators, with nothing better to do than monitor your every breath and gesture. When you milk your cow, the one remaining cow that hasn't died and triggered witchcraft accusations, neighbours watch from behind their own fences to see if you whisper to it, which could be interpreted as casting spells or communing with familiar spirits rather than simply talking to an animal the way everyone has done since domestication began. Old Agnes from the bakery has taken to positioning herself near her window at milking time, pretending to knead dough while actually observing whether you make any suspicious hand gestures or speak words that might be incantations disguised as ordinary conversation. When you tend your garden, people notice which plants grow well, because unusually successful crops are obviously the result of supernatural assistance rather than knowledge gained from years of agricultural experience, proper timing, or simply having better soil drainage than your less successful neighbours. You find yourself modifying your behaviour in increasingly absurd ways to avoid triggering suspicion, walking through your daily routines like an actor playing a role in a performance where the audience is hostile and the script keeps changing without notice. You avoid looking directly at other people's livestock, just in case someone later decides that your gaze was evil, keeping your eyes downcast when you pass the miller's pigs or the blacksmith's oxen, because apparently even casual observation of farm animals has become evidence of malevolent intent. You stop humming while you work, because singing could be mistaken for incantations, and you've heard that witches often use musical phrases to invoke their supernatural powers. The silence feels unnatural and oppressive, but it's better than giving someone new ammunition to use against you in future accusations. You even change the way you walk, trying to appear less confident and more submissive, because confidence in a woman is inherently suspicious in a world where female assertiveness is often interpreted as evidence of supernatural empowerment or demonic influence. The paranoia affects everyone in the village, not just you, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that transforms a once familiar community into a collection of suspicious strangers watching each other for signs of criminal or supernatural activity. People are monitoring each other constantly, looking for evidence of witchcraft, theft, adultery, or any other behaviour that might warrant investigation by the authorities. Every conversation is carefully modulated, every gesture considered for its potential implications, and every facial expression analysed for hidden meanings. Children are taught to report unusual occurrences to their parents: strange lights in windows, unexpected animal behaviour, neighbours working at odd hours, who report them to the authorities, creating a network of surveillance that would make totalitarian regimes proud of its thoroughness and efficiency. The village has become a place where trust is a luxury no one can afford, and where friendship itself has become a potential liability. Your neighbours have started avoiding you, not because they necessarily believe you're a witch, but because associating with accused witches is dangerous in a legal system where guilt by association is a real concern. An accusation alone is enough to trigger legal proceedings that might prove fatal. Your former friends now cross the street when they see you coming, their faces carefully neutral as they pretend not to notice your approach, and conversations stop abruptly when you enter rooms, replaced by uncomfortable silence and meaningful glances between people who used to greet you warmly. Women who once shared gossip and recipes now treat you like a leper, afraid that showing any kindness might be interpreted as support for witchcraft, or evidence of their own supernatural inclinations. Even the children, who used to play freely around your cottage, are now hurried past by parents who mutter warnings about staying away from dangerous people. The isolation is almost worse than the trust anyone, where any relationship might turn into an accusation if circumstances change, or if someone needs a scapegoat for their problems, and where your survival depends on maintaining perfect behaviour according to standards that are constantly changing and never clearly defined by people who seem to make up new rules based on their mood or personal grievances. The loneliness is crushing, made worse by the fact that you're surrounded by people who used to be part of your daily life but now treat you like a dangerous stranger who might contaminate them with suspicion or supernatural malevolence. Sleep becomes difficult because you're constantly alert for signs of trouble, your body refusing to relax even when exhaustion weighs down your limbs like iron chains. Every unexpected noise might be officials coming to arrest you for some new accusation. The sound of footsteps on gravel, voices in the distance, or doors creaking in the wind, all trigger jolts of terror that leave your heart racing and your hands shaking. Every whispered conversation between neighbours might be about additional evidence of your supposed crimes, new witnesses coming forward with tales of suspicious behaviour, or fresh accusations that could trigger another round of judicial ordeals. You're living in a state of perpetual anxiety that's probably more damaging to your health than the actual ordeals. Your body constantly flooded with the kind of stress that ages people prematurely and weakens resistance to disease. The fear has become a constant companion that colours every waking moment and haunts your dreams when sleep finally comes. The beginning of the end. Fortunately for you and for countless others living under this system of sanctified torture disguised as legal procedure, change is slowly coming to medieval justice, like dawn breaking over a landscape that has been shrouded in darkness for far too long. The Fourth Lateran Council has recently forbidden priests from participating in trials by ordeal, though this prohibition is being implemented gradually and unevenly across different regions, with some areas embracing the change immediately, while others cling to traditional methods like drowning and burning with a tenacity of people who've never known any other way to resolve disputes. The papal decree has sent ripples of confusion and resistance through the ecclesiastical hierarchy, as local priests struggle to understand what they're supposed to do when faced with accusations that previously would have been settled through hot iron tests and pond drownings. Some regions have received the news quickly through well-established church networks, while others remain blissfully unaware that their favourite methods of divine consultation have been officially discouraged by the highest authorities in Christendom. The Church's withdrawal from ordeals isn't based on sudden recognition that burning and drowning people might not be the best way to determine guilt, or on any newfound concern for human suffering and the rights of the accused. Rather, it's a practical decision based on theological concerns about forcing God to perform miracles on demand, as if the Almighty was some sort of cosmic servant who could be summoned to resolve every petty village dispute involving stolen chickens and cursed livestock. Church scholars have begun questioning whether it's appropriate to constantly demand supernatural intervention for legal matters, wondering if perhaps God has better things to do than personally oversee the judicial system of every small community in Europe. Apparently, requiring divine intervention for every legal dispute is being reconsidered as potentially presumptuous, an attitude that assumes too much familiarity with divine will and places unreasonable demands on supernatural resources that might be better deployed addressing larger theological concerns. This change is creating a crisis in the legal system that extends far beyond your small village, because without priestly blessing and divine intervention, there's no clear way to determine guilt or innocence according to methods that people have trusted for generations. Local officials who've spent their entire careers relying on supernatural judgment suddenly find find themselves without their most reliable tool for resolving disputes, like craftsmen, whose essential tools have been declared forbidden by royal decree. Some regions are experimenting with juries, groups of local people who listen to evidence and make decisions based on testimony and facts, rather than supernatural demonstrations or divine signs manifested through survival of torture. The concept is revolutionary and terrifying to people who've never imagined that mere human beings could be trusted to distinguish between truth and falsehood without direct assistance from higher powers. The transition is slow and reluctant, marked by resistance from officials, citizens, and even some of the accused, who've been conditioned to believe that divine judgment is more trustworthy than human decision-making. Many people, including legal officials who've built their careers around interpreting divine signs and managing supernatural trials, genuinely believe that ordeals are more reliable than human judgment because they remove the fallible element of mortal reasoning from judicial proceedings. After all, juries can be bribed with money or goods, intimidated through threats or social pressure, or simply wrong because they lack the divine insight necessary to perceive truth through the confusion of conflicting testimony and circumstantial evidence. While God is supposed to be incorruptible and infallible, always able to distinguish between guilt and innocence, regardless of how cleverly criminals might disguise their crimes or how persuasively they might protest their innocence. The idea that human reason might be more trustworthy than divine intervention is a radical concept that challenges fundamental assumptions about how the world works, the nature of truth, and the proper relationship between earthly justice and heavenly authority. You're witnessing the beginning of a transformation that will take centuries to complete, watching the first tentative steps toward a legal system that might actually care about evidence rather than supernatural endurance tests. The gradual introduction of evidence-based justice, the concept of reasonable doubt, and the presumption of innocence are still far in the future, distant developments that won't fully emerge for generations of legal evolution and social change. But the cracks in the system of trial by ordeal are starting to show. Hairline fractures in a judicial framework that has dominated European legal thinking for centuries, and slowly, painfully, alternatives are being developed by people who are beginning to suspect that human reasoning might be more reliable than divine signs interpreted through torture and near-death experiences. Your own case benefits from this transition in ways that feel almost miraculous after your recent experiences with systematic judicial torture. The local priest, influenced by the new church teachings, and perhaps troubled by recent events involving red-hot iron and judicial drowning, refuses to bless any more ordeals, declaring that he can no longer participate in procedures that demand supernatural intervention on command. The reeve, left without his preferred method of divine consultation and facing pressure from church authorities to find alternative means of resolving legal disputes, reluctantly agrees to let your case be decided by a jury of village residents rather than subjecting you to additional trials involving fire, water, or armed combat. The decision is made with obvious reluctance, as if he's agreeing to use an inferior tool when superior methods have been arbitrarily forbidden by higher authorities who don't understand the practical challenges of village justice. This jury system is primitive by modern standards. It consists of 12 men, no women allowed naturally because female judgment is considered inherently unreliable and potentially contaminated by emotional reasoning, who listen to accusations and testimony before making a decision based on their collective wisdom and understanding of community standards. They're not trained in law. They're not required to follow specific procedures beyond basic Christian oaths. And they're definitely influenced by personal relationships, village politics, family loyalty, which represents a fundamental shift towards treating legal proceedings as human endeavours rather than divine mysteries that can only be resolved through systematic torture and miraculous intervention. Your relief at witnessing this transition. The jury trial is almost anticlimactic after your experiences with ordeals, feeling strangely mundane and civilized after weeks of systematic torture disguised as divine consultation. People stand up and tell their versions of events in normal speaking voices, without the dramatic flourishes and religious invocations that accompanied your previous trials. Your neighbour repeats his accusation about the evil eye and the dead cow, but his words carry less weight in this setting, where they must compete with other testimony rather than being supported by supernatural signs interpreted through your suffering. You deny being a witch with a voice that's steadier than you expected, and several of your oath helpers testify to your good character, describing years of neighbourly behaviour, acts of kindness, and the simple reality of knowing you as an ordinary person rather than a supernatural threat. A few witnesses mentioned that you were seen working in your garden at the time when you supposedly cursed the cow, providing something resembling an alibi. The revolutionary concept that your physical location during alleged magical activities might actually matter to the determination of guilt. The jury deliberates for what feels like hours, but is probably only a few minutes. 12 men huddled together in earnest conversation, while you stand with your heart hammering against your ribs, knowing that their decision means the difference between freedom and execution. You can see them gesturing and occasionally glancing in your direction, their faces serious, but lacking the bloodthirsty excitement that characterized the crowds during your ordeals. They're discussing evidence and testimony like merchants evaluating the quality of grain or wool, applying human judgment rather than waiting for divine signs to manifest through your pain and suffering. They return with a verdict of not guilty, based primarily on the lack of evidence beyond a neighbour's accusation and the testimony of your character witnesses. It's not a ringing endorsement of your innocence, more like a reluctant admission that there simply isn't enough proof to justify execution, but is enough to end the formal proceedings against you and restore your legal status as a free person rather than an accused witch awaiting divine judgment. You walk out of the makeshift courtroom feeling simultaneously relieved and traumatized, your legs shaky with the aftermath of fear, and your mind struggling to process the fact that you're actually going to survive this ordeal. The relief is overwhelming, washing over you like warm water after the cold terror that has dominated your life for weeks, but is mixed with a deep exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue. You've survived a legal system designed to kill accused people regardless of their guilt or innocence, a judicial framework that treated your life as expendable in the pursuit of supernatural certainty, but the experience has left you with infected burns that may never fully heal, psychological trauma that manifests in nightmares and sudden panic when you hear unexpected sounds, and a deep suspicion of your neighbours that will probably last for years. The trust that once bound your community together has been shattered like pottery dropped on stone, and you're not sure it can ever be fully repaired. The transition from ordeals to jury trials doesn't solve all the problems with medieval justice. Women still have fewer rights than men. Peasants still receive different treatment than nobles based on arbitrary social hierarchies. And evidence collection is still primitive by any reasonable standard. Witnesses aren't cross-examined. Physical evidence isn't systematically preserved or analysed, and legal procedures remain inconsistent from village to village, depending on local customs and the preferences of whoever happens to be in charge. But it represents a fundamental shift from supernatural justice to human judgment, from divine intervention demanded through torture to rational deliberation based on testimony and community knowledge. The change feels experimental and insufficient, like watching the first tentative steps of a child who will eventually learn to run, but still has years of development ahead. You're living through one of those historical moments when society slowly realises that maybe, just maybe, there might be better ways to determine guilt and innocence than elaborate torture disguised as religious ritual. It's not a complete transformation. That will take centuries of legal development, social change, and gradual recognition that human reasoning might be more reliable than supernatural signs. But it's a beginning that feels both hopeful and fragile. The old ways die hard, and you can already hear some people in the village grumbling that divine justice was more reliable than human judgment, that juries can be fooled or corrupted, while God could always be trusted to reveal truth through trial by ordeal. The transition is happening, but it's happening slowly and with considerable resistance from people who've built their understanding of justice around the assumption that supernatural intervention is necessary to distinguish between truth and falsehood. As you return to your normal life, such as it is after weeks of legal proceedings that have left you physically scarred and emotionally damaged, you're aware that you've experienced something that future generations will look back on with horror and disbelief. You've lived through a legal system so absurd, so divorced from logic and justice, that people centuries in the future will struggle to believe it actually existed, reading about trials by ordeal in history books with the same incredulous fascination they might reserve for accounts of human sacrifice or other barbaric practices from humanity's darker past. You've survived something that will eventually be seen as a monument to human ignorance and cruelty, a judicial system that combined religious fervour with systematic torture to create a framework for justice that was neither just nor particularly religious in any meaningful sense. Your scars are proof of a historical moment when civilization took a temporary detour through madness, before slowly finding its way back toward reason, evidence, and the radical idea that human beings might be capable of determining truth without divine assistance, delivered through red-hot iron and judicial drowning. Ending rest now, knowing that your ordeal is finally over, that you've survived a system where justice was determined not by evidence or reason, but by your ability to endure fire that seared your flesh and left permanent scars, water that filled your lungs while you fought desperately to stay alive, and the judgment of neighbours who barely understood what they were witnessing, yet felt qualified to determine your fate through their interpretation of divine signs manifested through your suffering. Sleep well, in the knowledge that slowly, gradually, like dawn, breaking over a landscape that has been shrouded in darkness for too long, the world is learning that guilt and innocence shouldn't be determined by divine thermometers that measure God's favour through the temperature of molten metal pressed against human skin, or supernatural floating tests that confuse basic physics with theological revelation, or the outcome of random violence between hired champions who've never met the accused and care nothing for truth beyond their payment. Close your eyes and let the tension drain from muscles that have been knotted with fear for weeks, knowing that the absurdity is ending, the logic is beginning, like seeds of reason planted in soil that has been barren of common sense for generations, and you can finally rest, knowing that tomorrow's accusations won't require you to prove your innocence by surviving the impossible, by demonstrating supernatural powers that no innocent person should be expected to possess, by enduring torture that would challenge the faith of saints and martyrs. Rest now, faithful witness to history's strangest chapter, a living survivor of humanity's most bizarre experiment in judicial procedure. Sleep well, with the knowledge that your scars tell a story that future generations will read with horror and disbelief until dawn calls you long overdue the recognition that evidence matters more than supernatural endurance. Let your breathing slow. Let your heart find its natural rhythm. Let your mind release the hypervigilance that has kept you alive through trials that should never have been inflicted on any human being. For you have witnessed the end of an era, the twilight of a sisterhood